The British Army's Accidental Psychological Weapon, a song that made German troops surrender. The evening of August 15, 1941, falls across the North African desert with an orange haze that only the Mediterranean climate can produce. A British radio operator at a makeshift transmission station near Alexandria adjusts his dials, his fingers hovering over frequencies that should carry military communications. But tonight, something different emanates from this facility, something that no general had specifically ordered, no military strategist had carefully planned, and yet something that would, in the months and years ahead, penetrate deeper into German lines than artillery, infiltrate soldiers' minds more effectively than leaflets, and create a psychological impact that military planners had never anticipated. A recording begins to play, simple and melancholic, the voice of a German woman singing a song that had been popular in Berlin's cabaret clubs before the war. The frequency is tuned so that it will reach forward German positions. The British officer manning the equipment cannot know it yet, but this moment marks the beginning of one of the war's most peculiar and least understood psychological operations. What began as an experimental broadcast would become something far more significant. Evidence that music, properly deployed, could shake the resolve of hardened soldiers more effectively than any conventional weapon. The story of how the British Army discovered this power, how they weaponized a simple popular song, and how they used it to erode German morale across North Africa and eventually Europe, is a story of accident as much as intention, of improvisation as much as planning, and of the profound psychological vulnerability that even the most disciplined military forces possess. The problem facing British military planners in 1941 was not a new one, but it had become increasingly urgent. Conventional weapons could destroy enemy equipment, but they could not destroy enemy will. After 18 months of war, Germany had proven itself extraordinarily resilient. The Luftwaffe had failed to break British morale during the Blitz, despite the devastation wreaked on British cities. Yet still the war continued. German troops, particularly in North Africa, showed little sign of the psychological collapse that military theorists suggested should follow material defeat. When the Africa Corps faced setbacks, they regrouped. When supplies ran short, they adapted. When casualties mounted, replacements arrived from Europe. The British military's Psychological Warfare Division, operating from Cairo under the nominal authority of the Political Warfare Executive, faced a fundamental challenge. How do you attack something that cannot be seen, cannot be fortified, and cannot be replaced with parts ordered from Berlin? The conventional instruments of propaganda had proven blunt. Leaflets dropped over enemy lines were often destroyed before soldiers could read them, or, when read, were dismissed as enemy propaganda. Captured soldiers could be turned to broadcast appeals to their comrades, but many German troops dismissed these as men speaking under duress or broken by captivity. Radio broadcasts in German could reach German positions, certainly, but straight political messaging had limited effect. A soldier, tired, hungry, and far from home, cares little for speeches about Nazi ideology or appeals to surrender to the superior organization of British forces. What was needed was something more visceral, something that could reach soldiers below the level of conscious thought, something that could speak to homesickness, memory, and the fundamental human longing for connection to one's own culture. The military planners who identified this problem understood that the weakness of the German soldier was not a lack of fighting spirit or commitment, but rather a profound psychological vulnerability created by distance from home, the grinding exhaustion of desert warfare, and the steady accumulation of small disappointments and losses that characterized a war being fought in places no German soldier had chosen to be. The challenge was finding a weapon precise enough to target this vulnerability without broadcasting one's intentions to the enemy. The solution came not from a general's office, but from the observation of a group of radio engineers and a handful of intelligence officers working in Cairo. Among them was John Amory, a controversial figure whose family background included both privilege and scandal. who had defected to the Nazis and would later broadcast German propaganda. But more importantly, there were voices at the BBC's Arabic service who understood the power of music, and among them were operators who had access to captured German recordings. Someone, at some point in 1941, made the connection. Rather than using captured German political broadcasts or appeals from German prisoners, they would broadcast German entertainment. They would transmit songs that German soldiers knew from home, music that would remind them of wives and girlfriends left behind, of cafe culture in peacetime, of the Germany that existed before the war consumed everything. The specific song that became the center of this operation was Lili Marleen, recorded by the German singer Lael Anderson in 1938. The melody was simple, almost banal, built on a harmonic progression that lingered in the mind. The lyrics told the story of a soldier standing guard at a gate, waiting, smoking a cigarette, thinking of his beloved Lily. It was domestic, intimate, tinged with melancholy and longing. The British decision to broadcast this song repeatedly over German radio frequencies was technically straightforward, but psychologically sophisticated. The radio operators at Alexandria and later at other stations would broadcast the song on frequencies known to be monitored by German forward positions. Sometimes they would broadcast it with minimal introduction. Sometimes they would frame it as coming from German radio itself, creating the impression that the transmission was reaching occupied territory from the Reich's own broadcasting authority. The technical achievement required careful coordination. Radio engineers had to identify the exact frequencies being monitored by German units, establish transmission times that would reach these positions during hours when soldiers might be listening, and arrange for sufficient broadcasting power that signals would penetrate reliably across the desert distances. The voice used for the broadcasts was crucial. Lael Anderson's original recording, discovered by the British intelligence services, had the authenticity and emotional resonance that no British impersonation could achieve. The song was broadcast repeatedly, sometimes several times in a single evening, always on frequencies known to reach German positions. What made this operation distinctive was its reliance on emotional rather than rational appeal. Military propaganda typically seeks to persuade through argument, emphasizing the enemy's losses, highlighting one's own strength, threatening consequences for continued resistance. The Lili Marleen broadcasts operated on a different level entirely. They did not attempt to persuade. They simply reminded German soldiers of what they had left behind, of the distance from home, of the fact that the war had separated them from the intimacy they longed for. The broadcast did not say, "Surrender and you can go home." It simply played a song about longing and let each soldier reach his own conclusions. The operational deployment of this psychological weapon began in North Africa and would continue in various forms throughout the war. In the autumn of 1941, reports began reaching British intelligence from captured German soldiers and from agents operating in Axis territory suggesting that Lili Marleen had become extraordinarily popular among German troops. What had been conceived as the experimental broadcast had struck something genuine in the German military psychology. Soldiers requested the song. Officers reported that morale seemed affected during its broadcasts. By early 1942, the song had become so ubiquitous that German forces attempted to block the broadcasts by broadcasting their own, more militaristic versions. But this only increased the attention paid to the original. Italian forces, fighting alongside the Germans in North Africa, also began to tune in to British broadcasts specifically to hear the song. By the middle of 1942, the British psychological warfare effort had expanded to include not only Lili Marleen, but other songs known to be popular among German and Italian troops. The broadcasts were coordinated with timing to maximize reach. Evening broadcasts when soldiers gathered at wireless sets, overnight broadcasts when those on watch duty might be listening in isolation. The evidence suggests that while the broadcast did not directly cause surrenders, They contributed to a psychological environment in which surrender became a contemplated possibility. Captured German soldiers reported that the song had become almost unbearable to hear, creating a nostalgia so intense that it undermined their psychological readiness for combat. Officers reported requests for the song to be banned because of its effect on morale. Whether this represents the song actually making troops surrender, or rather creating psychological conditions in which morale eroded, remains a matter of historical interpretation. The records available suggest the psychological impact was genuine, even if its translation into military action was indirect and difficult to quantify. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe would genuinely help us continue investigating these oddly specific corners of military history that so few documentaries bother to explore. The comparative context for this operation becomes clearer when examining what the Germans and Americans attempted in psychological warfare, and how those efforts differed fundamentally from the British approach. The Germans conducted extensive radio propaganda operations, particularly Radio Berlin, which broadcast appeals in multiple languages. These broadcasts typically emphasized German military strength, highlighted the futility of continued Allied resistance, and made direct appeals to soldiers to surrender. Records suggest these broadcasts had minimal effect. German soldiers largely discounted them as enemy propaganda, and many seemed almost immune to direct persuasion. The American approach, operating primarily in the Pacific Theater, focused heavily on factual broadcasts about military situations combined with explicit appeals to surrender. These broadcasts provided accurate information about battle outcomes, casualty figures, and Allied military capabilities. They were psychologically informed but remained fundamentally rational in their appeal. They asked soldiers to surrender based on logical assessment of the military situation. The British Lily-Marleen operation differed categorically. It made no explicit appeals. It provided no information. It simply broadcast a song, allowing the psychological impact to operate entirely in the listener's emotional and imaginative realm. Where German propaganda asked listeners to accept arguments about German invincibility, and American propaganda asked them to accept facts about Allied superiority, the British operation asked nothing explicit. It simply opened a door to homesickness and longing, and allowed each individual soldier to walk through that door as far as he wished. The evidence suggests this approach had a more profound psychological effect precisely because it did not try to persuade. It acknowledged something that rational propaganda could not address, that soldiers do not make decisions to surrender, primarily based on calculations about which side is winning. They make those decisions based on how much they can endure the separation from home, how much longer they can sustain the emotional and psychological strain of warfare, how much hope remains that their individual survival is possible. The song did not promise these things. It simply reminded soldiers that these longings existed, and that they were suffering for their absence. This proved more destabilizing than any rational argument. Intelligence reports from Allied forces operating in North Africa describe German prisoners stating that the broadcasts had affected them psychologically, that hearing the song had reinforced their sense of being far from home, that repeated exposure had created a kind of psychological ache that was difficult to suppress. Some sources suggest the broadcast may have been used specifically before operations where the Allies were attempting to encourage surrender or demoralization among German units. However, establishing direct causality between the broadcasts and specific military outcomes remains impossible, given the historical record available. What can be stated with confidence is that the broadcasts were extensive, sustained, and, according to contemporary reports, effective in creating a measurable psychological impact on German personnel. The legacy of the Lily-Marleen broadcasts extends beyond their immediate military impact into broader questions about psychological warfare, the nature of military morale, and the surprising vulnerabilities of disciplined military organizations. The broadcasts demonstrated, somewhat accidentally, that emotional and cultural appeals could penetrate where rational propaganda failed. The song itself transcended its role as a weapon. After the war, Lily Marlene became famous across Europe and the United States, recorded by numerous artists, performed in concert halls and cabarets, celebrated as a cultural artifact of the war era. The haunting quality that made it effective as psychological warfare, that melancholic evocation of separation and longing, proved universally resonant. In that sense, the British military discovery of the song's power prefigured modern understanding of how music and emotional content penetrate human consciousness more effectively than rational argument. The song also became something of a bridge between former enemies. German veterans who had heard the broadcasts spoke of the song with complicated emotions: anger at how effectively it had exploited their homesickness, but also recognition that in doing so it had reminded them of their common humanity. Italian soldiers similarly spoke of the broadcasts as a moment when the rigid structures of military discipline gave way to individual human longing. This humanizing effect may, paradoxically, have contributed to the comparative civility with which some German and Italian troops surrendered to British forces in North Africa. They had been reminded by a song that they were men separated from their homes, not ideological warriors in the grip of iron discipline. The operational legacy of the Lily Marlene broadcasts influenced subsequent psychological warfare campaigns throughout the remainder of the Second World War. The Allies recognized the effectiveness of emotional rather than rational appeals. Radio broadcasts were expanded to include music, entertainment, and cultural programming alongside overt propaganda. The principle that morale is vulnerable to cultural and emotional pressure, not merely to military defeats, became embedded in psychological warfare doctrine. After the war, military strategists studying psychological operations continued to reference the Lily Marlene campaign as a distinctive success precisely because of its indirect nature and its reliance on emotional rather than rational manipulation. The song survives today in various recordings and remembrances as a cultural artifact associated with this operation, though many listeners are unaware of its role in psychological warfare. To return to that evening in August 1941, when a radio operator in Alexandria adjusted his dials and allowed a melancholic song to travel across the desert toward German forward positions. What was set in motion was not quite what anyone planned. No general conceived of psychological warfare through popular song. No strategist drafted a paper advocating that the British military exploit homesickness through broadcasts of pre-war German entertainment. Yet this is precisely what occurred, and it operated with the effectiveness that more explicitly designed propaganda campaigns could not achieve. The accidental genius of the operation was that it recognized something fundamental about human psychology that had been largely ignored in earlier psychological warfare efforts: that soldiers are not primarily motivated by grand ideological arguments or rational assessments of military superiority. They are motivated by deeply personal longings for home, for family, for the ordinary pleasures of peacetime life. A song could speak to these longings far more effectively than a speech. The Lily Marlene broadcasts demonstrated that the discipline and ideological commitment that made the German military formidable could be undermined not through superior argument or rational persuasion, but through the simple acknowledgement of human vulnerability. The broadcasts did not pretend that soldiers could go home if they surrendered. They did not make grand promises. They did not even explicitly encourage surrender. They simply played a song and allowed each listener to contemplate what he had lost and was losing through the continuation of the war. In this sense, the operation succeeded precisely because it was modest in its claims and emotional in its appeal. The broadcasts created a psychological space in which previously unthinkable thoughts of surrender, of escape, of refusal to continue, could arise. Whether this space translated directly into military action remains debatable. What is certain is that the broadcasts were effective enough to be recognized as a significant innovation in psychological warfare influential enough to shape subsequent campaigns and historically interesting precisely because they revealed that sometimes the most powerful weapons are those that do not announce themselves as weapons at all. They are simply reminders of what we have lost and what we long to recover. The British Army had not set out to create a psychological weapon through a song, but in the desert night, with a recording playing across radio frequencies toward distant German positions, they had discovered something that military innovation had failed to achieve through conventional means: a way to speak directly to the human vulnerability that lies beneath all the training, discipline, and ideological commitment that military forces represent. In that discovery lay both the peculiar genius of the operation and its troubling implications about how easily even the most hardened soldiers can be reached through the simple exploitation of their deepest longings.